He had nothing to sell. That is the first thing to understand about Ronald Pelton, and the thing that sets him apart from almost every trader before or since. He carried no documents out the door. He photographed no key lists. He smuggled no film, no microdots, no folders of stolen paper. When Ronald Pelton walked away from the most secret building in America, he took only what was already inside his own head. And it turned out that what was inside his own head was worth more than any briefcase of files a man could carry. Because Ronald Pelton had listened. For 14 years, he had sat inside the National Security Agency, the agency that listens to the world, and he had listened to the Soviet Union, to its signals, its codes, its military traffic, its undersea cables. He had a near photographic memory and an encyclopedic command of how America eavesdropped on its great adversary. And when his life fell apart, he discovered that he could simply walk into a Soviet building, sit down, and recite it. He did not need to steal a single page. He was the page. This is the story of how a bankrupt analyst sold the sound of the Cold War. The secret of how America was listening for $35,000 over 5 years. It is the story of an operation so audacious that submarines crept into Soviet home waters to tap a cable lying on the ocean floor, and of how one man from memory gave it all away. And it is the story of the strangest break in the history of American counterintelligence, a Soviet defector who handed over the clue and then changed his mind and defected back, and a 5-year-old tape recording of a man's own voice played to him in a hotel room near midnight that ended everything. Ronald William Pelton was born in 1941, an Ohio boy. Bright in a quiet way, with a gift for languages, he learned Russian, really learned it, the hard, idiomatic Russian of someone who could think in it, not just translate it. That single skill carried him into the one place in America where it was worth the most. In 1965, at the height of the Cold War, he joined the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland. To understand what Pelton became, you have to understand where he sat. The NSA is the signals intelligence arm of the United States. The listeners, where the CIA runs human spies who steal secrets from people, the NSA intercepts communications, radio, telephone, telemetry, the electronic murmur of the entire planet. And within the NSA, the most sensitive division of all in those years was A Group, the office that targeted the Soviet Union itself. Pelton worked in A Group. He was an intelligence analyst holding the highest clearances, a Russian linguist who could not only intercept Soviet communications, but understand them, weigh them, and explain to others how the whole collection machine functioned, which signals America could read, which ones it couldn't, where the listening posts were hidden, how the take was gathered and processed and turned into intelligence. He knew, in other words, not just secrets, but the secret of the secrets, the architecture of American eavesdropping against the Soviet Union. And that knowledge was never written on a single sheet of paper he could have stolen, because it didn't need to be. It lived in his exceptional memory the way a musician carries an entire symphony in his head, every part, every entrance, nothing on the stand in front of him. He could close his eyes and walk the whole structure of it. For 14 years, he was, by every account, a competent and trusted officer. He came to work. He did the job. He held his clearances year after year, and the agency renewed its trust in him the way it renewed everyone's, by checking the boxes and finding nothing out of place. He married. He had children. He bought a house in Maryland and settled into the long gray routine of a government professional with a secret life that was, at that point, simply the ordinary secret of his ordinary classified work. And he made, at the end of all of it, about $24,500 a year. That salary is the hinge of the whole case. Hold on to it. Ronald Pelton could not manage money. It is a small, ordinary, almost embarrassing failing, and it brought down operations worth billions of dollars. He spent more than he earned. He invested in things that went nowhere. He reached for a life, a boat, the house, the comforts of a man who felt he had earned more than the government paid him. And the debt compounded the way debt always does, quietly for a long time, and then all at once. By the spring of 1979, the arithmetic had become impossible. In April of that year, Ronald Pelton filed for personal bankruptcy. His debts came to $64,650, more than 2.5 times his annual salary, set against a house he valued at just $31,000. On paper, he was ruined. And here is the first failure of the institution that should have been watching him, the failure that made everything after it possible. A man who held the keys to America's listening posts, a man whose memory was itself a classified document of the highest order, formally declared himself financially destroyed, and the system did not react. There was no mechanism that treated an A-group analyst's bankruptcy as a counterintelligence event. There was no one whose specific job it was to look at a broke man with that knowledge in his head and ask the only question that mattered. What is a desperate man who knows all of this worth to the other side? The bankruptcy was a matter of public record. It went into a file. No alarm rang anywhere. In July of 1979, Ronald Pelton resigned from the National Security Agency. He left voluntarily, a man stepping away from a stalled career, and the agency processed him out the way it processed anyone out. He turned in his badge and walked through the gate at Fort Meade carrying 14 years of the deepest secrets the United States possessed, and no one stopped to consider that the secrets were leaving with him, packed inside a mind that nothing on earth could redact or recover. For a few months, he tried to begin again. He dabbled in a sailboat business. He chased small ventures. He did the flailing of a man treading water in deep debt with no clear way to shore. None of it worked. The bankruptcy had wiped the slate, but it had not killed the wanting, and the wanting was worse now because he had less. By the start of 1980, Ronald Pelton had arrived at the same dark place where so many others had stood. The place where a cornered man takes inventory of everything he has left and realizes that the most valuable thing he owns is the one thing he is supposed never to sell. But Pelton's situation had a peculiar twist. He had no access anymore. He could not photograph a keyless the way John Walker had because he no longer had a job, a desk, a clearance, a building to walk into. All he had was the contents of his own skull, and he made the calculation that no security officer had ever imagined a man could make. He decided that the contents of his own skull were enough. On the 14th of January, 1980, Ronald Pelton picked up a telephone and called the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. Pause on the sheer nerve of that and the sheer blindness of it. The Soviet embassy on 16th Street was, as every American intelligence officer knew in his bones, one of the most heavily surveilled buildings in the United States. The FBI listened to its telephone lines around the clock. The NSA, Pelton's own former employer, helped collect against it. To telephone that embassy was to speak directly into a microphone you knew the other side did not control, that your own side did. Pelton understood this better than almost any human being alive, because for 14 years he had been on the listening end of exactly this kind of collection. He knew that calls to that building were recorded, and he called anyway. He called, and he arranged to come in, and he went to the embassy and offered himself. The Soviets, careful as ever, did not parade him through the front and out again where the watchers could photograph him. They moved him quietly, slipped him out by a route meant to defeat surveillance, and then they began to take the measure of what had wandered in off the street. What they found astonished them. Here was a former A-group analyst, a Russian-speaking insider, fluent, technical, recent, who could answer their questions about American signals intelligence in granular, devastating detail entirely from memory. They did not need him to bring anything in a bag. They only needed him to sit in a chair and talk. And talk he did. Over the next 5 years, Pelton met his Soviet handlers, most consequentially abroad, in Vienna, the great neutral crossroads of Cold War espionage. He traveled there in 1980 and again in 1983, and on those trips he was not skulking through alleys or servicing dead drops in the rain. He stayed at the residence of the Soviet ambassador to Austria, a guest, in effect, of the state he was betraying, and he sat for debriefings that ran, on some days, 8 hours at a stretch. A KGB officer named Anatoly Slavnov led the questioning. Day after day, hour after hour, in comfortable rooms, they drained him. They pulled out everything 14 years of listening had stored, and through one man's patient recollection, they reconstructed the entire shape of how the United States heard the Soviet Union, the systems, the priorities, the gaps, the vulnerabilities, the places where Moscow was naked and never knew it. Picture those rooms. A middle-aged American, red-haired, soft-spoken, sitting with a cup of coffee across from a Soviet intelligence officer who could barely believe his luck, answering questions for 8 hours, the way another man might give a deposition. Calm, thorough, reaching back into memory for one more detail, one more program, one more frequency, one more operation. No documents on the table. Nothing to photograph or file. Just a voice, reciting the secret architecture of American eavesdropping, while a tape, perhaps, turned somewhere to capture it for the archives in Moscow. For all of this, for handing over the structure of American signals intelligence against the Soviet Union, Ronald Pelton was paid, across 5 years, about $35,000 plus expenses. It is one of the bleakest pieces of arithmetic in the history of espionage. John Walker did roughly comparable damage and was paid something close to $1 million. Pelton sold the listening secrets of a superpower for less than the cost of a modest house. For less, in fact, than he had owed on the day he declared bankruptcy. He did not even get rich on his treason. He got spread thinly over 5 years, barely enough to keep the wolf from a door he had already lost. Of everything Ronald Pelton recited in those long Vienna sessions, one secret stood above all the rest, and it was almost too extraordinary to be real. Its name was Ivy Bells. Operation Ivy Bells was one of the most daring intelligence operations the United States ever attempted in any domain, in any era. Somewhere on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, a body of water nearly enclosed by Soviet territory, deep inside what Moscow regarded as its own protected home waters, there ran an undersea communications cable. It linked a major Soviet naval base to the mainland command, and along it traveled the internal communications of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Much of that traffic was sent with little or no encryption because of an assumption that seemed unbreakable. The cable lay on the bottom of a Soviet sea, in waters no enemy submarine could possibly penetrate. Why encrypt heavily what you are saying inside your own locked house, on a wire lying on your own floor? The United States got inside the house. American submarines and specially modified boats and divers operating at extraordinary, dangerous depths located that cable on the seabed and placed on it a device, a tap pod, that read the signal passing through the cable by induction without ever cutting it or breaking the line. The Soviets had no way to know it was there. Periodically, the submarines would creep back into those forbidden waters, retrieve the recordings, and carry home a treasure of Soviet naval communications that the Soviet Navy did not even believe could be collected. Moscow's sailors were standing in their own living room, talking freely, never imagining that the floorboards themselves had been wired to listen. It was, in the most literal sense, a sound. The captured electromagnetic murmur of a cable lying in the dark at the bottom of an enemy sea, brought up by men who had risked their lives to plant the device that caught it. And it was, by many measures, the single most valuable signals intelligence operation of its time. Ronald Pelton knew about it. And in Vienna, calmly, from memory, he told the Soviets the damage was total and could never be undone. Armed with what Pelton told them about where and how the Americans were listening, the Soviets went out and searched their own seabed, and they found the tap. In 1981, they recovered the pod from the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. The operation that had taken such genius and such courage to mount was simply switched off. Not defeated by any failure of American daring or engineering, but ended by a bankrupt analyst, reciting a memory in an ambassador's guest room for a few $1,000s. The recovered tap, by some accounts, was put on display, a trophy of a victory the Soviets had not earned so much as been handed. The sound went silent, and for a long time afterward, American counterintelligence did not even understand why. That is the heart of what makes the Pelton case so quietly terrifying. He did not sabotage a machine. He did not destroy a facility or burn a network of agents the way the document-stealing traitors did. He simply told the other side what America could hear, and so America stopped being able to hear it. Not just in one sea, but in ways and places the agency could only begin to guess at, because everything Pelton knew was now compromised and there was no telling how far the rot ran. You cannot photograph the inside of a man's mind on his way out the gate. You cannot run a memory through a metal detector or seal it in an evidence bag. Pelton sold something no security procedure on Earth had been designed to stop because it had never existed in any form but his own thoughts. For 5 years, no one looked at Ronald Pelton. And why would they? He was a former employee, gone, off the rolls, a private citizen, quietly failing at one small business after another out in the ordinary world. The institution that had failed to flag his bankruptcy in 1979 had no follow-up that would somehow catch him in 1981 or 1983. He held no clearance to renew. He sat for no polygraph. He filed no annual financial disclosure. He had stepped entirely outside the lines of the system, and from out there, he was simply invisible. The very act of quitting had erased him. A serving officer might eventually trip an alarm, a lifestyle that outran a salary, a polygraph flutter, a colleague's unease. But a man who had walked away, taking nothing physical, sitting on his secrets in a modest house in Maryland, left no surface for any tripwire to catch on. So the listening operations went dark, one by one, and the NSA knew, after Ivy Bells went silent, that somewhere a source had been catastrophically compromised. But knowing that is not the same as having a name. They had no thread, no face, no suspect. The man who had sold the sound had dissolved back into the texture of ordinary American life, into debt and small ambitions, and the gray anonymity of a citizen no agency had any reason to watch. By every rule of the trade, he should have stayed gone forever. What finally broke it was not a brilliant mole hunt, not a clever piece of analysis, not a security officer's hunch. It was a defection, and one of the most bizarre defections of the entire Cold War. In the summer of 1985, a senior KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko walked away from his own service. In Rome in August, he made contact with the Americans and defected. He was a major catch. A man who had held senior counterintelligence responsibilities, who knew the shape of Soviet operations against the United States from the inside. And in his debriefings, Yurchenko began to give up what he carried. He did not know Ronald Pelton's name, but he remembered the man. Yurchenko recalled that back in 1980, the KGB had acquired a walk-in source, a former NSA man, an analyst, who had come to them on his own and provided extraordinary information about American signals intelligence. Yurchenko could not produce a name, but he could produce a shape. A former NSA employee, an analyst, a man, he recalled, with red hair. The Soviets had a work name for him and had guarded him closely, but Yurchenko had been close enough to the matter to hand the Americans a description. It was thin, and it was everything. Investigators took that description back to a source that had been sitting untouched in their own files for 5 years. And here the wheel of the case turns full circle in a way that is almost unbearable in its neatness. When Ronald Pelton telephoned the Soviet embassy on the 14th of January, 1980, the FBI had recorded the call. Of course they had. They recorded everything that came into that building. They had had the tape for 5 years, an anonymous voice on a monitored line, one among thousands, utterly meaningless without a name to fasten to it. Now, suddenly, they had a name to hunt for, or at least a way to find one. Agents combed through NSA personnel records for former analysts who matched Yurchenko's description, and the detail of the red hair narrowed an enormous field down to a small and manageable one. They built a pool of candidates. They came to a former A-group man named Ronald Pelton, and then they did the thing that shut the trap. They took Pelton's voice and compared it to the voice on the 1980 embassy tape. It matched. The man who had spent 14 years listening to others had, on the very first treasonous phone call of his life, been recorded. And 5 years later, that recording of his own voice became the rope that hanged him. Meanwhile, in a twist so strange it reads like fiction, the defector who had given the clue changed his mind. In November of 1985, to the disbelief and lasting humiliation of the CIA, Vitaly Yurchenko slipped away from his American minders during dinner at a Washington restaurant, walked out, and re-defected to the Soviet Union, claiming afterward that he had been drugged and kidnapped by the Americans, a story almost no one credited. The man whose memory had pointed the FBI straight at Pelton went home to Moscow, even as the net was drawing tight around his own former source. But by then, it no longer mattered. The clue had done its work. The tape had done the rest. On the 24th of November, 1985, FBI agents came to talk to Ronald Pelton. They did not arrest him at first. They interviewed him, and at some point in that interview, they played him the tape. They let him sit and listen to his own voice, recorded in January of 1980, arranging his own betrayal over the Soviet embassy's telephone line. There is no defense against the sound of your own voice. Pelton, confronted with himself across 5 years, confessed. He admitted what he had done. The embassy, the Vienna debriefings, the long hours of reciting from memory, the secrets he had sold. Late that same night, just before midnight, the agents arrested him. It happened in room 409 of the Hilton Hotel in Annapolis, Maryland. The man who had sold a sound was taken into custody on the strength of one. His trial in 1986 posed a peculiar problem for his own government because to prosecute Pelton was to risk confirming in open court the very secrets he had sold, to tell the world and the Soviets all over again exactly what Ivy Bells had been and what else might have been lost. The case had to be handled with extraordinary delicacy, the prosecutors threading an impossible needle, proving the crime in detail to a jury without committing, in the courtroom, a fresh act of disclosure. They managed it. Ronald Pelton was convicted of espionage. The judge who sentenced him said he had betrayed a special position of trust, that he had compromised the security of his fellow citizens and endangered American operations and American lives, and he handed down 3 concurrent life terms plus 10 years. It is tempting to make Ronald Pelton small, because in some ways he genuinely was. He was not an ideologue. He had no grand grievance against his country, no political conversion, no buried hatred to nurse. He was a talented man who was bad with money, and when the money finally crushed him, he reached for the only valuable thing he had left and sold it cheap. $35,000 over 5 years. He did it almost matter-of-factly, the way another man might cash out a retirement account early to cover a debt, except that the account was the listening secrets of the United States, and the penalty for early withdrawal was paid by the sailors who had risked their lives in the Sea of Okhotsk and by every operation that quietly went dark because the other side now knew how to hide from it. But the smallness is exactly what should frighten the people whose job it is to prevent the next one. John Walker was caught in the end by a wife who had carried the secret too long. Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen would be caught by the lifestyles
The money bought them, and the mole hunts the dead agents demanded. Ronald Pelton bought almost nothing, lived modestly, left no physical trace at all, and most cunningly of all, though he may not have planned it that way, quit his job before he ever betrayed it. He defeated the entire apparatus of physical security not by being brilliant, but by being, in the end, a memory with legs.
He understood, perhaps better than the people guarding the secrets did, that the most dangerous thing he knew could never be stolen from him or found on him, because it had never been anywhere but inside his own head. The institution's failures were, at bottom, failures of imagination. It did not imagine that a man's bankruptcy might be a security event as serious as a missing document. It did not imagine that letting a 14-year A-group analyst simply walk out the front gate was the same thing as letting 14 years of secrets walk out the front gate. It did not imagine that the danger could wear so familiar a face, answer to so ordinary a name, and have badged in every morning like everyone else until the day it didn't. And so for 5 years, while operations went silent, and a tap pod that American submariners had risked everything to plant sat as a trophy on a Soviet shelf, no one in American counterintelligence thought to look at the quiet, red-haired man who used to work just down the hall. Ronald Pelton served roughly 30 years. He was released in November of 2015. An old man by then, the Cold War he had wounded long since finished. He died in September of 2022 at the age of 80. The cable he betrayed lies at the bottom of a sea that belongs to another century. The operation he silenced is a declassified legend now, taught as a triumph and a tragedy. In the same breath, the most audacious thing American intelligence ever did beneath the waves, undone by the one thing it could never have put through a security checkpoint. Because in the end, Ronald Pelton never stole a document. He never carried out a file or a photograph or a single sheet of paper. He walked out of Fort Meade in the summer of 1979 with empty hands and a full mind, and for the next 5 years he sold what was in that mind a piece at a time, in comfortable rooms for the price of a used car. He sold the secret of how America listened, and by the time anyone finally thought to listen for him, the only proof that he had ever been there at all was a 5-year-old recording of his own voice, waiting on a tape in an evidence room for someone to finally put a name to the sound.